all of us would think of ourselves as modern. We have modern conveniences, cars, worldviews, and whatnot. But what does it mean to be modern? And this is the question that I was interested in, precisely because I think psychology helps us be modern in a way that doesn't reveal its modernity. So in other words, if I think of steel and concrete that make this building, I say, oh, that's modern, right? I can point to it and say, sort of, that's modern. But I might not sort of, if someone says, why are you modern? I might not point to myself and say, I am modern, right? As a person, my selfhood, my identity is modern. So how does that happen? So why is it that we sort of point to things as modern and not in some sense to our own consciousness as being modern? And this is the paradox of what psychology can do for us. We know that psychology is a discipline. There are professors and doctors who teach it and work on it. But in some sense, there's another type of psychology which is already embedded within us, and we have naturalized and normalized. I can turn to the newspaper and it says, if you want to be, at a meeting, you should wear a red tie, or a blue tie means this, or a striped tie means that, or how we sit and talk to each other can send certain psychological messages. And all undergraduates in the United States take Psych 101, so they learn how to not only understand psychology, but to participate, if you will, in the sort of the secret game of being possibly psychologized yourself, but engaging in the trick of uncoupling yourself from the psychology world. Every time I go shopping, I am the victim of some psychological study that has decided that men, when they enter a store, will turn right or turn left, or that luxury goods should be here or luxury goods should be there, or that this type of music makes you feel relaxed and maybe you buy more this way. There's not a store in the United States that hasn't been produced by sort of commercial psychologists we don't know who they are. These are invisible people who are continuously operating in our field. So why is it that we've sort of allowed ourselves to be manipulated in this way, sometimes very artificially, we might say, but actually we are participants in this manipulation all the time. So we have naturalized this in the same way that you could think of perspective in painting. In the 15th century, when perspective was invented, people go, wow, this looks really weird. Today, if you do a perspective, no one thinks it's weird. We completely understand what perspective means, whether you paint it or not. Psychology is the same thing, basically invented in the 1880s as a field and a discipline. We have sort of naturalized all of its, or many of its messages. So today we see it as completely normal. If you were going to 1850 and talk about psychology, people would go, that's like, I don't understand what you're talking about. So the idea of self with a capital S, which is sort of supposed to be integral to its identity and its relationship to other people. And the relationship with other people are supposed to be working and filled with empathy and connections and so forth. These types of worldviews are basically from the 20th century. And in some sense, you could really say after World War II, they were even strengthened by art and architecture that began to sort of look at psychology as a way to, in some sense, invigorate its own performability in the social world. So Gestalt Psychology, which is a particular way of understanding how objects become, in some sense, embodied certain psychological principles. So it's not just humans having a psychology, it's now an object can have a psychology, right? Which might sound sort of strange, but basically this was very much a powerful argument in the 50s. Or we could look at how certain spaces can affect us psychologically. Dark spaces, light spaces, with windows or no windows or whatever it is, and we can analyze the psychological impact that architecture has on us or could have on us, and not just sort of how we go shopping, but how architecture itself becomes a medium for certain psychological manipulations. Do you design those while you're designing, so to speak, right? Or do you use those operations to produce certain type of architecture of effect? Or do you design a building and then in some sense forget that there are effects that you produce through certain types of manipulations? So what I wanted to research was how we sort of are continuously playing the game while pretending not to play the game. And this is a philosophical project as much as it is a question about psychology, because it gets to where do we position this magical self that is both empowered through psychology and simultaneously rendered disempowered through psychology, right? In other words, if someone can look at me and render me transparent by analyzing the way I move my body, the type of clothes I'm wearing and so forth, then in some sense I'm becoming sort of invisible in the larger scheme of reality. But of course, I wouldn't feel that because psychology tells me about certain types of empowerments. So art and architecture, particularly already in the early 20th century, but particularly in the 50s and 60s, sort of embraced this problem. I would say by the time we got to the 70s and 80s, it realized that it was harder to play the game than one would expect it. So in art, we see the drift towards psychoanalysis, which is a much more complicated, purposeful-driven, subjectivist-driven sort of art project. Not about sort of psychological connections, but about your own personal issues, if you will. Architecture also drifted away from the psychological structure by looking at other types of issues having to do with the cultural paradigms, historical agencies, and so forth. But there was a moment in the 50s when psychology really was sort of part and parcel of how many artists and architects sort of functioned, both theoretically, in positive, but also simultaneously, if you will, disempowering or rethinking the questions of architecture as a stable building with a function and a program, and that's all you have to talk about. All of a sudden, to study architecture, you had to study all sorts of different things, right? Including impacts and these sort of more difficult things to talk about. The psychologizing of modernity, which is a sort of process in which psychology sort of seeps like water into a sponge. You don't see the water, you just see the sponge, right, getting bigger. You know that if the water's in there, it's just that you don't really see it. But if you squeeze a little bit, you get the drips sort of start coming out, right? And what is it that is collected in that sponge of modernity, right? That if you try to look at it, if you think of the squeeze as being sort of like architectural or theoretical sort of research. And you can trace the different sort of philosophers, artists, architects, theorists who are embedded in that sponge. So, for example, Lipps, who is a German psychologist, he's the one who sort of, you could say, discovered the idea of empathy, the fact that we sort of relate to people individually by understanding each other's psychological realities. And you could sort of go from there to someone like Arnheim, who was an architectural theorist, who writes about how space becomes, we might think of a concrete building as, what does that have to do psychologically? But he talks about how space within certain buildings, even modern buildings, force us to think in a certain or feel certain things. So we can feel a sense of exhaustion by walking up a long staircase, or we can feel a sense of community by walking into a space where there are chairs and tables. So by understanding how these spaces produce certain communalities or individual spaces, individual realities, we can be designed in that particular way. So Arnheim looks at various things like a sports stadium as a psychological space. So we are on our own, might like the Patriots, or we might like a certain basketball game. But when we're in a stadium, a whole different psychology develops that is meant to be produced by the stadium itself. So the stadium is not just looking at a sports thing, it's a psychological space about, communal participation in a particular event. And the way the sound is organized, and the way the music is put in, and the way the seating and the viewing and all this stuff is meant to produce certain effects. Another great example is the building by Peter Zumthor, a Swiss architect. It's a bathhouse in Switzerland, in Therme Vals. And this would be, a classic example of a type of psychologized space. So here he wants a building where you go into the water, you're isolated by yourself, even if there might be a few other bodies sort of floating around, right? He wants you to understand that the stone is cut in a particular way so that you're seeing the stone. The lighting is very sort of mysterious and dark, coming, from the oblique angles. Even the changing room with its red coloration and its the windows looking out in different ways is meant to produce a sense of tranquility, repose, a type of thoughtfulness in how you're supposed to behave how you're supposed to think, how you're supposed to get into the water. It's sort of a cleansing activity. It's not just a place where you go and get wet and sort of say, that was really a nice sauna, right? So it's supposed to have a whole sort of almost mystical experience about it. And it's fabulous, and people really love it. So architecture is particularly sensitive to, if you will, the individual psychology and how you use architecture to mold certain psychological experiences. So it's not just the experience of being in a bathhouse and washing and getting wet and the heat and the cold and so forth, but the architecture is a particular strong player in the materials that were chosen and how the materials are used and shaped around you. So I give these two examples as a stadium when it's meant to be loud and powerful and everybody's chanting the same thing. There's one type of psychological space. Zumthor's space, which is just the opposite, it produces exactly the opposite effect. But both spaces are meant to produce certain effects within you. They're not just go to pay your admissions and do something. They're supposed to transform you in a particular way. So from the very, very quiet to the very noisy, but they all participate in that project, which is to affect your psychological inner being maybe by the time after an hour or two after the bath you've forgotten it. But I mean, I'm sure Zumthor would hope that it's a life-changing experience in some way, right? Just as going into a football stadium with 40,000 other people would be a life-changing experience if the first time you've done this. So psychology is there very much in how certain architects, not all, understand their operations within the design framework. Some architects could care less about it. That still doesn't mean that psychology is out of the game. It's just that it's just not part of the conscious aspect of design. But some architects will very clearly use psychology as a way to sort of begin to understand the manipulative aspect of the people that are using it. Today, if you compare and say, well, we study in architecture school, where psychology is really never discussed at all anymore. It's a completely forgotten discipline. No one studies how buildings affect you as such, right? I mean, you sort of have an intuition in the architectural school about how these things work. You might design a stadium and you might know, of course, that it impacts your psychology. But we don't really study psychologists. We don't have them coming in and sort of helping us inform our decision. That's sort of a separate, seen as completely separate. That doesn't mean that psychology doesn't saturate through everything. And if you think of how in even what Rem Koolhaas calls sort of junk space, right? Just, shopping centers, right? Shopping centers are like 100% built around psychology to get you to do more shopping. So what is the psychology of shopping? So if you're designing a shopping center, you may not be a world star famous architect, but you're using psychology a lot. So you could say that much of the junk space around us, the places where we go shopping or we buying food or this or that, these are to a large extent sort of already saturated with certain prototype ideas about how we respond psychologically. So McDonald's has people who have understood the psychology of buying fast food, right? And what the color repertoire is, right? The orange is supposed to sort of excite a certain salivatory processes, that have just biological production, right? That get you want to sort of to buy food. So we're sort of in that manipulative world, and architecture plays in that world, whether we teach it or not. I mean, you can sort of think that's what it is. So as a theoretical postulate, it's probably nowhere in the academic world. But in the practical world of sort of the built world out there, in the boxes and in the shopping centers and in the restaurants, there's a lot of psychology and the manipulative world around it. How do we analyze that? That's the critical part. Many of these studies are proprietary. We can't find, you're not going to find them on any website, that's for sure. And you have to dig very, very deep in the research to understand how these things are operating. And by that time we get into sort of sociology or into sort of almost anthropology of space, which brings us far from architectural design, but I think needs to be really forwarded much more so that we see architecture how in some sense it plays a very dynamic role, even if it may be just a box. We may not think, how can a box be a part of sort of an architectural world, but it actually might have more impact on us and how we present ourselves as the modern subject than we might think. So the question is always, not just what architecture is, but how architecture and us as modern subjects relate to these types of spaces. And for that, we need a lot more research.